In this video, we're going to be using ChatGPT 3.5 and Fusion 360 to make an API script, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to be using ChatGPT to try to make a script in Fusion 360. Now, I figured for this project, and full disclosure, I've tried to do this probably a dozen times, but for this project, what we're going to do is repeat a project we did in episode 8 of the API series, which was creating a configurator of parts based on CSV inputs. Now, CSV, or comma separated values, is just going to be a spreadsheet of values for length and width. So pretty straightforward, but what we want to do is see if we can get ChatGPT to make the same thing or a little bit better version of it. So to get started, let's first remind ourselves of the design, and you can go to the description of the video and download this, but it's essentially just a basic representation of a cabinet door with length and width values that can control its overall size. So that's going to be the basis for creating this configuration. We also need to have access to OpenAI or ChatGPT. Now, this is a free service right now, and I'm not using GPT-4, which I'm told by several people is much better, because I've had a little bit of difficulty finding a good version of it that is free, and it's sort of changing all the time because it's still in development. And of course, so is ChatGPT 3.5. But for right now, 3.5 is free to use. The only places that I could definitely find GPT-4 were in paid services. Other places that claim to use it, it wasn't specifically clear in their documentation if it's for free or paid versions. So for this example, we are sticking with GPT 3.5. I have had several comments. People get different results from what I found. So walking through this example, what we're going to do is I will copy the prompts that I put into ChatGPT and I'll put them in the description of this video. But we're going to go through step by step, and we're going to go any problems that we run into, any issues that we have to work through, we are going to have them in this video. It's not going to be a perfect solution where you just punch in text that I put in the description and you get a program that works. It's just not that simple, at least from my experience so far. I have made working versions of a couple different programs where I've had to do a handful of the coding. We're going to try to do as little coding as possible, but there is going to be some level of API knowledge that is helpful here. When we take a look at ChatGPT, we also should keep in mind that the Fusion 360 API help file is going to be important. Sample programs and feeding ChatGPT code on how things are done is going to be an important step in the process. I also have Bard open, which is another AI that I played around with. I found that this gave me more of a traditional Python object-oriented programming script, and I wasn't able to get great results out of this for Fusion API. ChatGPT is sort of locked in time pre-2022, so any updates that have happened are not going to be available. Some other AI resources are current and up to date. So keep that in mind, that depending on what you're using, if you're using it for Arduino or for Raspberry Pi or something else that maybe is changing or updating a bit more frequently than the Fusion API, you could potentially run into a wall based on when this has access to data. So to get started, my first prompt, I want ChatGPT to help me make a portion of the script that just allows me to open a CSV file and display the results inside of Fusion. So that's simple, that's all we need to do. But you need to be very careful on how you ask it this. Now, looking at the code it provided, I can already tell you that there are going to be a few issues. I have noticed in some instances it will try to import Autodesk.Fusion 360, which is not real, so you will need to remove the 360 if that happens. Also, this Fusion 360 utilities is not going to be recognized in most cases, so we are going to have to remove that, which it did mention at the end of the code. If you don't have it, just replace it with Autodesk Fusion, which is actually already here, so we don't need to replace it. Another thing I have noticed it do quite a bit is at the end of this def run, it will put another run at the bottom. So depending on how many times you've interacted with ChatGPT, you may notice that you have an extra run at the bottom, which will go through the program twice. Make sure that you remove that as well, or tell it that it's not needed. Now, a couple of things that I will notice right away in here, that it's using this app Autodesk Core Applications Get, which is perfectly fine. UI app user interface, perfectly fine. But it never declares the design in the document, which are traditionally declared in the start of all programs. It is going to be needed downstream, but it's not technically needed just yet. This CSV file path open file dialog, that's not correct. It should be using create file dialog and then show open. We'll give it the benefit of the doubt and we'll try this, but I don't think it's going to work. So I'm going to be using an empty program that I already created, and it's just 000 ChatGPT. You'll need to create a new one, so simply select create, Python, name it whatever you want, and then use that going forward. So for me, I'm just going to go into the empty program. I'm going to paste everything, noting that this Autodesk Library Fusion Utilities is not a real thing for us, so we're going to remove it. And there is still one more issue here, and that's this right here. It says traceback. It's not defined in Pylance, so we actually need to import that as well. So comma, traceback, and for whatever reason, it just didn't. So now it's happy, at least there's no errors here. So we're going to save this, and we'll go to Fusion and try to run it. You can run it directly from Visual Studio, but because I'm working, essentially recording a single monitor here, I'm going to switch back and forth and run it from Fusion. So we'll say run, and instantly we get an issue, and you can see here it's that open file dialog. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy that and go back to ChatGPT and simply tell it that we had this error. I like to put them in brackets just to separate them a bit, and then give it as much information as you have available. So if you know, in this case, I know that the open file dialog is not correct, that it should be using the create file dialog, then I'm going to go ahead and just give it that bit of information. You can leave that out and try to see if it can figure it out. But if you do know that, if you already have that information, it's a good idea to put it in there. So we'll give it that bit of information. We'll see what it generates. Again, we'll probably have to add that traceback in and remove the Fusion 360 utilities. We can tell it that information to remove that from future code and to add traceback, but it's just going to get hung up on those things, and I'm just going to manually remove them, which is totally fine. So now you can see it's using UI create file dialog. That's fine. If dialog is okay, then create the file path. It's using this R here, which is read only, which is fine. We don't need to save any data to it. And then it's going to use this append row and add this information here. So let's go ahead and copy that code. We'll go into our program here, paste it, again, get rid of this, add traceback, and we'll save it. So let's see if this update works. So now I'm going to select a CSV. So here's the contents, length, width, and then these are the rows and columns. Now, if this was a little bit wider, length and width would probably be displayed next to each other, but it probably is just wrapping around. So 3620, 4820, 3212, that's exactly what's in the CSV file. So far, so good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the program that works, because we did make some slight adjustments, and give it that information back. So you can see we put it in, basically telling it this was the working program and if it can use it. And then it said certainly, and for some reason, it's just going to repeat exactly what we had there. Not a big deal. Maybe it needs to do that in order to store it, but now we have it that we can just simply copy it from there. So let's just review what we did so far. At the very beginning, we asked it to create a simple script that allowed the user to open a CSV and put it in a message box. So it did this, it made some errors, things that we had to remove, things we had to add. Knowing that open file dialog didn't work, we had to basically feed it back this error message. Now, because the error messages are going to be somewhat subjective based on your responses, you don't necessarily want to copy all the prompts that I put in the description of this video. It's possible that you get a different response, so don't just copy and paste what's in the description without understanding what it gave you back. So after we told it there was an error and we needed to use create file dialog instead of open file dialog, it was able to go through and update the code for us. So then we said, great, we want to reference this program. Again, on your end, I'm not going to put all of this code in the description of the video, partly because some of the brackets and things aren't going to work in the description of the video. YouTube won't allow. So I'm just going to have the prompts such as this. This will be in the description of the video. So once we have that, now it gave us the program, and now we want to add a bit more. We want to add some more functionality. So the UI message box to display the CSV data isn't really needed. It was just an extra step to make sure the data was coming in. What we can do from here is we can either remove it manually, comment it out, whatever we need to do, or just leave it in there as a nice check. So the next thing that we needed to do is capture data from the current design that's open. Now, this gets a bit tricky, and I found that it gets hung up quite a bit on all the different attempts I've had here. It seems to confuse the active product and active document when it's trying to get access to some of these things. So we need to be very specific about where it can get this information. So we gave it a simple prompt adding to the program to capture the details of the location of the current document as well as the file name. And the reason that's important is because we want to be able to change the file name. We could simply just use the file name and add something to it like the length and the width, but we're going to make sure that we can capture that information first. Looking at the code, it references the active product and as the active product here. Usually the way that we do this is we just say design equals active product. And then here for the parent folder, it didn't actually create, it used the active product here, but then down here, it just accessed the app.active document instead of calling something document. Now downstream, this could potentially be a problem because we may need to access something like that. But so far, I mean, it looks correct, but we did have to give it some very specific prompts. So let's go ahead and put this into the program and see what it does. So paste everything, save, no errors or warnings, so that's good. It's a good start. And in Fusion, we're going to go ahead and run this. Select a CSV. Now it gives us this information, which is interesting. And it gives us the parent folder on the same dialog. And if this doesn't make any sense, that's perfectly fine, because when we see GPT save test as our parent folder, that's the sort of user-facing name. In the back end, it's going to be a bunch of numbers and letters, and this is actually what Fusion needs. And then you can see the active design name is cabinet. So it has that information. So now the next step we can move on to is using that information, updating our code and doing something with it. So I'm going to leave the UI message box in there for now. It's a good check on where we are in the program. And the next thing that we want to do is we want it to be able to update the design's user parameters. And this is another place where I found it gets confused in trying to access the user parameters. So we need to, again, be very specific. So just 2 prompts here. We want to give it a fair shot at figuring this out. There is going to be more. We do want to go back and add user input for the file name, but for right now, I'm just going to use the file name as is in the design rather than complicating that first part of the program. That's something we could add manually if we need to. All right, let's go ahead and take what we have here. We're going to copy that. We're going to put it into our program. See if it works. So in Fusion, we're going to run ChatGPT, select a CSV file, and we get an error. So we can see here, line 54, new design parent path folder, error unsupported operand type, plus data folder and string. So the data folder is not technically a string. And I think that's where it's running into an issue, because basically it needs to be able to convert that information. So we're going to go ahead and just give it this error and let it figure it out. Again, what you need to do on your end is if you have the same error, copy that and paste it back to ChatGPT. I'm not putting this error into the description of the video, but again, it's going to be very subjective. It's going to depend on what codes you get, whether or not it works. Now, I have noticed that things like the design name, the parent folder, those kinds of things, it seems to struggle with those, understanding what data it can get from the active product and what is the active document. And part of that is because the object-oriented programming structure for Fusion, for any API, is very specific to that API. And ChatGPT can reference a lot of data quickly, but it's not an expert programmer. So something we need to keep in mind, we need to feed it information, error messages certainly, and anything else that we have that can be helpful. So I'm going to copy this code. I am going to put it in here. I'm going to save it, and I want to take just a quick look. So file dialog, this is all fine. CSV data, this is fine. Length and width, it's putting it into an array, or it's accessing it from the first and the second position. 0 represents 1, 1 represents 2. Then it's got the design active product. So again, this is interesting because this active product was used, originally it was used up here, and it's now declaring design as the active product down here for whatever reason. Not a big deal. This is where coding it yourself is going to come in handy because you can structure the program a little bit better. But again, it doesn't mean that it's not going to work. So we get the user parameters. I don't know why it has these if statements here. It doesn't really need to do that. All it needs to do is set the parameters based on the expression, item by name dot expression, and set it equal to length and width. But again, I'll see if it works. And then it's trying to save the design. So we'll give it a shot. Let's go back to Fusion. We'll run it. Select a CSV. And again, still have this error. Line 54 in run new design path equals parent folder plus that. Basically, it can't add those things together. So let's go check out the code again. So essentially what it's saying is that this file type for parent folder and the new design name are different than this. So it's not able to put them together. So if we come back up where it got the original data file, so active design name, this would be our file name. And if we look down here, active design name. So this should be a string. And then it is trying to essentially format length and width in this way. That's perfectly fine. This line should work fine. This is the one that it seems to have the error. So the parent folder, that right now, if we look at the way that it got it, parent folder is the data file parent folder. So that's perfectly fine. Really, none of this is actually needed. So I'm going to comment those out. And the save as is just going to be, so this is a little tricky because save as needs a couple of arguments. It needs the design name, which is new design name. It needs the path, which in this case, we're just going to use parent folder because that's the path that it needs. That way we don't, it's not trying to add anything to the path for some reason. And then there's some optional arguments for description, and you can see that up here in this tooltip. It's looking for those optional arguments, and now it's optional argument of tag. I'm just going to put tag. And these are things when you save a design, you have the option to put in a description there. Not going to worry about adding anything. Those are just going to be defaults. We'll save it and we'll see if that works before we go back to ChatGPT. So we'll select it, we'll run, select our CSV, and nothing instantly happens, but now we get this, parent folder GPT save test, that's fine, and active design cabinet. So you'll notice now it's pulling this out instead of the actual ID in the back end, it's actually pulling this out as the true name. We'll say okay. And you can see now we've got our 3 different files saved here. Now, a couple things that we didn't do, we didn't ask for user input, which is something we did on the original program. That's something we certainly can do. We can manually code it or we can add it if we want. And the other thing that we didn't do is we didn't ask it to close this design, which does actually present some problems with updating the data panel. I don't know why, but for some reason it seems to take a while on one of the designs. Even if you refresh, it just seems to take a while. And I'm not really sure why, but I think it has to do with the code not closing out that design properly. But again, it's just, we're just going to let it do. I have noticed that this does eventually finish updating, so that's fine there. So let's go back to the code, and everything appears to be working. It does display this UI message box at the end, which tells us that all of those things are there and everything's been saved. So if we want to add to this program, now that we've made some changes, basically we got rid of this new design path stuff, and we want to do anything with it, we should feed this back into ChatGPT. But the other thing that we can do is just manually add to the code, which might honestly be easier. It really depends on what your level of experience is and what's easiest for you. So I think that's a good place to end. I think that we should continue to use it, figure out what it's going to be good for. I think if it was given a little bit more insight into the Fusion 360 API structure, I think it would be a much more beneficial tool. Again, I've been told GPT-4 is much better at responses. Bard did pretty well in terms of creating object-oriented programming code, but it didn't work super great for Fusion API. If you have played around with it, I would like to hear how, the types of prompts that you used and how you were able to get around those things. But I think that's as far as I'm going to take this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.